It started with a sound, a single, piercing shout that seemed to carry across the fields behind my property. I first heard it on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the sky hangs low and gray, and the smell of damp soil permeates the air. I had been walking back from the local hardware store, hands full of gardening supplies, when it happened. The shout was sharp, urgent, but distant, echoing like it had traveled through hollow tunnels underground. It was a human voice, unmistakably male, yet filled with a desperation I couldn't identify. My heart skipped. There were no other houses in sight, no one on the road, nothing but the sprawling, empty farmland that stretched behind the shed at the far end of my property. At first, I assumed someone had been working late in a neighboring town and shouted for some reason. I strained my ears, listening for a second response, maybe a laugh or another shout, but there was nothing. Silence swallowed the air. The stillness made my skin crawl. The shed itself had been empty for years. I inherited the property from my uncle after he passed, and he had never stored anything of significance there. Just tools, empty shelves, and old boxes that had rotted away. The wood had begun to splinter, the roof sagging like it carried some invisible weight. I had been hesitant to go near it at night, always thinking of it as a place where shadows like to linger. But now, hearing that echo, something pulled me toward it. I wasn't thinking rationally. I walked across the uneven field, the grass brushing against my shins, the sound of my own footsteps sharp in the silence. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to the warmth of my house, but I couldn't. I reached the shed just as twilight faded. The sky was now an impenetrable gray-black, the faint silhouettes of trees swaying in a gentle wind. I paused at the doorway, the old wooden frame groaning under the wind's pressure, and stepped inside. The shed smelled of rot, dust, and old wood. The faint light from the moon filtered through gaps in the boards, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I called out softly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My own voice sounded hollow in the confined space. And then it happened. The shout returned. Closer this time. Louder. Clearer. But there was no one there. I froze. The echo was bouncing from the far corner of the shed, but the corner was empty. No figure, no movement, nothing to indicate a living being. My pulse hammered in my ears. I tried rationalizing it, perhaps a fox caught in the shed, or the wind through a broken plank creating strange acoustics. But it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded human. Terrified, screaming, echoing off the walls, I backed toward the doorway, wanting nothing more than to leave, but then I heard something else, a whisper. "Don't leave." It was faint but distinct, human. Deliberate. It seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wanted to call out, to speak, to demand an answer, but my throat had gone dry. My hand shook, gripping the doorframe. And then I felt it, a cold pressure against my shoulder. Not the wind, not a branch. Something tangible, yet invisible. Something that made me want to run, but my legs refused to obey. I bolted through the tall grass, across the uneven terrain, until I collapsed on the front porch of my house, heart racing, lungs burning. The sound of the shed fell silent as I reached the warmth of the indoor lights. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just imagination. I had been working long hours in isolation, my mind playing tricks. But even as I lay in bed that night, I could hear it, an echo, faint but persistent, in the distance calling my name. The next day, I inspected the shed in daylight. Everything appeared normal. The old wood groaned when touched, but nothing had moved. No footprints. No disturbances in the dirt floor. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the shed itself had changed. The shadows looked darker. The air inside felt heavier, almost oppressive. I didn't understand it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. That evening, I tried to avoid the field. I busied myself inside, reading, cleaning, anything to distract from the memory of that echo. But then it came again. A sharp shout, unmistakably human. Not a whisper this time. Not distant. Right outside the window this time, where I could see nothing but the empty field. I approached cautiously. The grass was undisturbed. The field was empty. But the air carried a faint chill, a feeling of eyes watching from the darkness. By the end of the first week, the echoes had become a pattern. Every night, just after dusk, a shout would pierce the air. Sometimes near, sometimes far. Always human, always terrified, and always followed by that whisper, "Don't leave." I tried recording it. I set up cameras, microphones, anything to catch evidence. But every recording captured nothing. No sound, no figure, nothing. It was as if the shed swallowed the truth, leaving only my perception behind. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake, listening for the slightest movement, the slightest sound. I began to dread the approach of night, yet I couldn't resist going back, drawn to the shed like a moth to a flame. Then, one night, it changed. The shout was not alone. It was accompanied by movement. A dragging sound from within the shed, low and deliberate, like something being pulled across the dirt floor. I stood at the doorway, heart racing, hands gripping the frame. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A presence, heavy and deliberate, pacing just out of sight. It stopped abruptly, and then the whisper came, louder, urgent, and close to my ear, though I was alone outside the shed. "Come in." I wanted to run, but my feet moved toward the shed before I could stop them. Inside, the air was colder than before. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. The walls appeared closer, the ceiling lower, as if the shed itself were constricting around me. The dirt floor seemed to pulse underfoot, uneven, moving like it had a heartbeat. And then I saw it, a figure, fleeting, pale, half seen at the far corner. I blinked, and it was gone. But the echo remained. Not the shout, not the whisper. Something else. A sound that wasn't my own voice, yet perfectly mimicked the panic and fear in my chest. Every movement I made, it echoed back, louder, distorted, twisted. I realized then the truth wasn't just an echo. It was a voice. Mine. Or at least a version of me, screaming, terrified, pleading. And every night, the shed pulled more of it from me, shaping it, twisting it, throwing it back into the air to lure me in again. By the time dawn broke, I staggered out, shaking, exhausted, with a whisper still in my ears, "Don't leave. We need you." After that first week, I realized I couldn't avoid the shed forever. Sleep had become impossible. The echoes, the whispers, the dragging sounds, they followed me, haunting the corners of my house, lingering in the shadows of every room. I began keeping a notebook, recording every sound, every feeling, every sight. But as I documented them, patterns emerged. Not just the timing, which was always at nightfall, but the way the sound changed based on my presence. If I approached the shed, the echoes became louder, closer, urgent. If I stayed away, they would drift, fading, almost calling me back. Something about the shed was alive. I decided to investigate its history. The town library was small, dusty, and filled with the faint smell of mildew and old paper. I combed through property records, old newspaper clippings, and local archives. What I discovered chilled me. The shed had stood for nearly a century, a relic from a time when the land had been farmland, not the isolated property it had become. It had been part of a homestead owned by a man named Henry Calloway, who had disappeared in 1928. According to the records, neighbors reported hearing loud, desperate screams coming from the shed for several nights before his disappearance. No trace of him was ever found, though searches covered miles around the property. Then came the next name, decades later, a young boy named Thomas Ridley, who had vanished in 1954. The details were vague, but local rumor mentioned a voice calling him into the shed, and his body was never recovered. Every few decades, someone connected to the shed disappeared, always during dusk or nightfall, always with screams, whispers, or dragging sounds reported. I asked the librarian if anyone ever investigated further. She shook her head. Most of the disappearances were written off as accidents, kids wandering off, people leaving town. But the old-timers will tell you, that shed isn't ordinary. It's cursed, I suppose. We call it the Whispering Shed, though few admit it aloud. I felt my pulse quicken. I had heard that term once before from a retired farmer who lived a few miles away. He had been vague, evasive, warning me not to go near the shed after dark. But curiosity had driven me back again and again. That night, I returned to the shed, notebook in hand. The sun had set, leaving the field bathed in darkness. Shadows stretched across the dirt, twisting and swaying in ways that made my stomach churn. I approached the door, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. As soon as I stepped inside, the air shifted. Heavy, cold, and metallic. The smell of decay, rot, and something I couldn't identify filled my lungs. And then I heard it, the shout. Closer this time. Louder. Not a faint echo across the field, but right inside the shed. I froze, notebook trembling in my hand. The dragging sound followed, slow, deliberate, circling the floor. I turned the flashlight, scanning every corner, but there was nothing. Nothing alive. Nothing human. Then came the whisper, "Don't leave. Stay." It wasn't faint this time. It was inside my head, echoing across my skull. I forced myself to write it down. Every word, every sound, every instinct. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. Scratches in the dirt floor. Fine, shallow marks, almost like tiny claw marks, circling the center of the shed. I crouched down, examining them. They were not new. They had been there for decades. Layers of dust and dirt concealed them partially, yet the edges were fresh, sharp, as if someone or something had dragged them recently. The feeling of being watched intensified. I could sense a presence just beyond the flashlight's beam, waiting, patient, hungry. Over the next several nights, I returned to the shed, documenting everything. I began leaving small objects inside. A chair, a mirror, a candle. Each night, I would find them moved, sometimes broken, sometimes missing entirely. The mirror reflected not the empty shed, but shadows that shouldn't exist. Shapes that shifted when I blinked. Figures at the edges of my vision. One night, I placed a recorder in the shed. The next morning, when I listened, there was silence. Absolute silence. Until at the very end, my own voice emerged, shouting, screaming, echoing in a way that was not mine. The sound twisted, warped, distorted. I could barely recognize it. I became obsessed. I spoke to neighbors, but no one would talk openly. One old man, Mr. Calhoun, hinted that previous occupants had tried to destroy the shed, burn it down even, but nothing worked. He said he'd seen people enter, never return. The shed remained. The land around it remained quiet and empty, yet the shed waited. I started noticing other signs. Small footprints in the grass, just outside the shed, appearing overnight. Deep depressions in the soil, like something heavy had been dragged across it. Broken branches around the perimeter, though the trees were untouched. The shed seemed to feed on fear, growing stronger with every investigation. Then came the first encounter. I was inside, late at night, notebook and recorder in hand, flashlight cutting across the shadows. The air was thick, almost solid, pressing against my chest. The drag sound began again, circling closer, circling faster. I saw movement in the corner, pale, shapeless, and then a voice, my voice, shouting from every direction at once. I covered my ears, but the sound penetrated my skull. My knees buckled. I tried to leave, but the door slammed shut. Not by wind, not by wood. Something alive had closed it. The whispers followed, now countless voices overlapping, chanting, "Stay, stay, don't leave, cool me." I realized then that the shed wasn't just haunted. It was sentient. It responded to me, fed on me. I barely escaped that night. Collapsed in the field, soaked in sweat, shaking, I realized the shed had marked me. The echoes weren't random. They were personal. Each shout, each whisper, each dragging sound seemed to anticipate my actions. The shed was not waiting for anyone. It was waiting for me. By the end of the second week, I knew something had followed me home. I could feel it in my chest, a cold weight pressing me down. In mirrors, I thought I saw figures that weren't me, shadows that didn't match the furniture. And at night, I could hear it breathing outside my bedroom window, dragging across the grass, circling closer. The town's old archives revealed more. Dozens of names connected to the shed, all missing, all with reports of hearing shouts in the empty shed before vanishing. Some claimed they were pulled inside by voices. Others were found days later, wandering, incoherent, terrified beyond reason. There was a pattern. Every disappearance occurred after repeated exposure to the shed. First, hearing the shout, then seeing shadows, then the whispers, then the full contact, the dragging, the presence, the echoing of their own voice. I realized the horrifying truth. The shed consumed fear. It fed on those who approached, shaped their perception, broke them down, and eventually claimed them entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, lights on, doors locked, listening. The echoes still came, shouting my name, from the field, from the shed, from somewhere deeper. And the whispers, "Don't leave. Stay. We need you." I knew I couldn't resist it forever. And yet, I couldn't turn away. The shed had become the center of my life. My obsession, my fear, my doom. By the third week, I began noticing the shed's influence during the daytime. I had thought its reach was limited to nightfall, to the whispers and echoes that haunted the darkness. But then I started seeing things that didn't belong. Shadows that shifted independently of the sun. Shapes at the corner of my vision that disappeared when I turned my head. The soft, dragging sounds that once were confined to the shed's interior now seemed to resonate from beneath the floorboards of my own house. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, isolation. The human mind is capable of creating monsters out of shadows, especially when one is consumed by obsession. But then came the first undeniable proof, the footprints. I found them one morning while tending to the lawn. Small, shallow depressions in the grass, roughly human, but not quite. They seemed elongated, unnaturally thin. They appeared to have been pressed into the soil recently, though I had left the area untouched. I followed them instinctively. They led straight toward the shed and then vanished. I circled the shed, flashlight in hand, though the sun was high. The shed's wooden walls seemed darker than before, as if the shadows inside it had thickened and spread outward. Even in daylight, the air around it felt heavier, colder, suffocating. I could see my breath, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind, or perhaps generated by something else entirely. "Come closer." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck rising. It was unmistakable. The same voice that haunted me at night. The same echo that had been pulled from the deepest recesses of my mind. Now I was out here, in the middle of the day, in the sunlit world that was supposed to be safe. I wanted to run, but my feet moved toward the shed, step by step, drawn by a force I could not resist. Inside, the air remained cold and heavy. The shadows inside the shed had multiplied, thickening, writhing like smoke trapped in a bottle. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse, the boards creaking in time with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I could hear the echoes again, distorted now, interwoven with the whispers, my voice shouting, screaming, pleading, but it wasn't me. Not entirely. It was something else using my voice, shaping it, bending it, echoing it back to me in ways my mind could barely comprehend. I began experiencing hallucinations during the day. It started subtly, flickers in the corner of my vision, a shadow moving against the flow of sunlight. Then the sounds, low scraping, faint shouts, whispers behind closed doors. The more I ignored them, the louder they became. The shed's influence was expanding beyond its physical boundaries. I noticed changes in myself, anxiety that clawed at my chest, trembling hands, a constant, gnawing sense that I was being watched, even when I was inside my locked house. The lines between reality and the shed's influence began to blur. One afternoon, I saw a figure in my kitchen. It was pale, thin, almost translucent, standing in the corner, motionless. I called out, but no response. My voice sounded hollow in my own ears. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the feeling remained, like its gaze had burned into my brain. The neighbors began to notice too. Mrs. Halloway, who lived down the road, stopped waving at me when I passed. She would glance at the shed and quickly look away, her face pale, eyes wide with an expression I couldn't read. Children crossed the street when they saw me, muttering warnings under their breath. I tried speaking with them, but no one would give details. They only shook their heads, muttered about the shed, and scurried away. It was as if the shed's influence had extended into the town, and anyone aware of it kept their distance. I experimented with electronics, trying to measure the phenomenon. Cameras, microphones, even EMF detectors. Nothing recorded the whispers or shouts. The visual anomalies were always gone when captured on film. Only my perception could register them. One night, I set up a full-motion camera in the shed during daylight hours. When I reviewed the footage, I found my own movements delayed by a fraction of a second. My arms reached for objects before I consciously decided to move them. Shadows moved independently, sliding along walls in ways physics could not explain. And in the center of the frame, the floor rippled, as though the dirt beneath it were water. The shed was alive, and it was learning me. By this point, I was living in terror 24/7. I stopped leaving the house except for essential trips. Food, water, supplies. But even then, I felt the shed's gaze following me. Each step outside felt like trespassing into its domain. The whispers came at all hours now, overlapping my thoughts, merging with my own internal voice until I could no longer distinguish between fear and reality. One day, I noticed a subtle but horrifying change in my reflection. I looked into a bathroom mirror and saw the shed behind me. Through the glass, its shadows thicker than the room could allow. And there, just past the doorway, a figure, pale, thin, human-like, dragging something across the floor. I spun around. Nothing. The shed was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure remained. I began to document my experiences in detail. I filled notebook after notebook with descriptions, sketches, diagrams, attempts to rationalize or make sense of what I was experiencing. The echoes, the whispers, the shadows, they all had a pattern. The shed communicated in layers. First the sound, then the sight, then physical sensations, cold, pressure, nausea, and then the echoing of my own voice. I realized the echo wasn't just a copy of me. It was an extension, a fragment of my consciousness that the shed had pulled out and warped. Then came the day I could no longer deny it. The shed had begun to manipulate reality. I was standing in the yard when I saw something impossible. The shed's door opened on its own. I wasn't near it. I hadn't touched it. And yet the flaps swung wide, a hollow, mocking gesture. From inside, I heard not a shout, but a string of words, my own voice distorted. Come. Cool me. We need you. Stay. I wanted to run. My body wanted to run. But something in me, some part of my mind I no longer recognized, walked toward it. Step by step, I felt the pull grow stronger. My heartbeat accelerated, my pulse syncing with the pulsing floorboards inside the shed. I had become part of its rhythm, its pattern. The sun was high, yet inside the shed, darkness reigned. Shadows clung to corners, elongating, shifting. Figures appeared just out of reach of the flashlight. I could hear dragging sounds above my head, around my feet, in every corner. And the whispers, louder, clearer, more insistent. Stay. Don't leave. It's waiting for you. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, and realized this was no longer just a shed. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that consumed perception, consciousness, and fear. And I had given it permission by returning night after night, day after day. By the end of the third week, I knew the truth. I was losing control. My sense of time had begun to fracture. Days blended into nights. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Whispers invaded my dreams. And always the echo, my own voice, shouting in terror from some place I could not see, from some reality I could not reach. I realized I was becoming part of the shed, a fragment of my own mind absorbed and reflected back. And yet, some part of me remained terrified, desperate to escape. But escape was no longer possible. The shed's influence had spread beyond its walls, into the daylight, into the neighbors' fields, into my own home. I could feel it everywhere, watching, waiting, learning. By the fourth week, I was no longer certain if the shed was part of the world I knew, or if I had been absorbed into some distorted reflection of it. Every day became a struggle against an unseen force that bent reality around me. The shadows I saw during daylight were now tangible, almost solid. They shifted when I wasn't looking, slithered across walls and floors, coiling like smoke, curling around furniture. And always the echoes, my own voice distorted, screaming, pleading, shouting in the abandoned field or inside my house, always carrying the weight of fear I couldn't escape. I knew I needed to confront it directly. I can't explain why. Rational thought had abandoned me long ago. The urge wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even fear. It was necessity, a compulsion. Something in my mind, perhaps what remained of my consciousness, drove me toward the shed, despite the horror I knew awaited me. The sky was heavy with storm clouds when I approached. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind tugged at my clothes like unseen hands. And the moment I stepped onto the threshold, I felt the air shift. The temperature dropped rapidly. My breath fogged in front of me, and the smell of rot, metal, and earth assaulted my senses. The shed was awake. The door groaned as I pushed it open. The shadows inside were thicker than I'd ever seen. The floorboards pulsed like a heartbeat. I swear I could feel it beneath my feet, moving, breathing, alive. The dragging sound returned, circling, deliberate, emanating from the far corners of the shed, though nothing was there. And then I saw it, a figure or multiple figures materializing from the shadows. Pale, thin, faceless with elongated limbs. They didn't walk. They floated, dragged, slid across the floor in ways that made no sense. The air was filled with whispers, overlapping, screaming, chanting, "Stay. Don't leave. We need you." My own voice joined the chorus. Not my voice. Exactly. Something twisted, warped, a reflection of fear and desperation. It echoed in my skull. I tried to retreat, but the door slammed shut behind me. Not with wood, not with wind, but with a force that was alive. The shed was closing around me. Every shadow seemed to stretch, coil, and press closer. The temperature plummeted further, yet a strange warmth pulsed at my core, drawing me inward. And then I understood. The shed didn't just consume fear. It consumed attention, will, consciousness. Every time I returned, every time I recorded, observed, or documented it, I fed it. Every fearful glance, every step toward it, every heartbeat, it had absorbed it and used it to strengthen itself. I reached for my notebook, desperate for some anchor. The pages were blank. Not torn, not wet, not burned, blank. All of my observations, diagrams, sketches, and writings had vanished. I panicked. The entity inside the shed was not just observing. It was rewriting reality around me. The shadows converged. Figures became more distinct. Pale faces pressed against the walls, some recognizable, some grotesque, some twisted versions of me. They moved closer with every breath I took. And then one of them spoke, clearly this time, its voice layered over mine. "You belong here." The floor beneath me rippled. I fell to my knees, clutching the dirt. The dragging sounds intensified, forming a rhythm. 1 step, 2 steps, around and around me. The walls seemed to breathe. The shed was alive. I realized it wasn't merely sentient, it was intelligent, calculating, patient, waiting, observing, shaping me into something it could manipulate. And then the pulling began. Not physical, not visible, but a pressure on my mind, like hands dragging my consciousness toward the far corner of the shed. My vision blurred. My heartbeat synchronized with the pulsing floor. My own screams were mirrored back at me, distorted, warped, amplified. Something touched me. Not with hands, not with fingers, but with presence. A force that pressed into my chest, stomach, limbs. It was heavy, suffocating, yet intoxicating. I staggered, unable to resist. I could feel it moving through me, around me, inside me. And then I saw it, the source. A hollow space in the center of the shed, blacker than shadows, pulsing like an eye. Inside it, reflections of myself, countless versions of myself, screaming, begging, clawing. Some are me from yesterday. Others, perhaps me from tomorrow. I couldn't tell. It whispered again, clearer than ever. Step inside. Stay. Don't leave. Be with us. I tried to resist, but my body moved toward it. I couldn't control my feet. My arms reached for the black center. My eyes, my own eyes, were drawn in. The surrounding figures coalesced into shapes I could barely comprehend. Faceless humanoid forms, elongated shadows, half-seen limbs, all reaching for me. I realized then what the previous victims had experienced. The shed didn't kill. Not directly. It trapped consciousness. It reflected fear, reshaped reality, drew you in until you were no longer separate. You became part of it, a fragment of the entity itself, feeding its next cycle of terror. And now, it had me. I fell forward into the darkness. Everything shifted. The shed's walls disappeared. The floor became liquid. The air thickened. Voices layered over my own, screaming, pleading, laughing, whispering my name. My mind fractured into pieces. Each shard echoed back at me, distorted, horrifying. And then I understood. The shout I had first heard wasn't distant. It wasn't someone else. It was me. Every echo, every whisper, every sound had been drawn from my own mind and projected back at me, amplified. The shed was me, and I was it. Time lost meaning. Hours? Days? Weeks? I no longer knew. Shadows and voices became my reality. Every thought, every memory, every fear existed only to be mirrored, twisted, and returned. I attempted to scream. Nothing came out. My voice had been consumed, replaced with echoes. The pale figures circled, dragging shadows along the walls, pressing closer. They were fragments of past victims, perhaps, or maybe only extensions of the shed itself, made visible for me to witness. Stay, stay, stay. The words carved themselves into my consciousness, impossible to forget, impossible to ignore. By the time I collapsed against the pulsing black center, I realized the full horror. Escape was impossible. The shed did not exist in the physical world alone. It existed in perception, in memory, in fear. It followed, it watched, it waited. And as I surrendered, fully aware of what I had become, I understood something more terrifying than death itself. Even if I ever left this place, the shed would leave a fragment behind. A whisper, a shadow, a fragment of me, screaming, calling, dragging someone else toward it. It was endless, infinite, patient, and I was no longer just a witness. I was part of the echo. I lost track of time. I can't say if it had been days, weeks, or months since I first stepped into the shed. My mind no longer registered hours or sunlight. The whispers and shouts had become constant companions, threading through every thought, every heartbeat. Each fragment of consciousness I had was being mirrored back to me, twisted and reshaped into fear. The shed was no longer just a structure. It was a presence, an intelligence, a predator that existed across perception and reality. It fed not on flesh, but on awareness, on attention, on the living essence of fear. And I was its chosen meal. I still remember the night it fully claimed me. The wind had picked up, rattling the broken boards. I felt the first stirrings of a presence behind me as I approached the shed, my feet moving as if independently of my will. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to resist, but the pull was irresistible. Inside, the air was thick, metallic, and rotten. Shadows clung to corners and floors like living ink. The dragging sound circled me faster than ever, echoing through the structure. And then I saw them, figures from the previous disappearances. Pale, thin, faceless. Twisted shadows of the people who had been trapped, absorbed, and reflected into the shed's endless cycle of horror. They didn't move toward me. They merged with the shadows, becoming one, swelling the darkness, thickening the air until it pressed against my chest. And then I heard it, my own voice. Or rather, my echo. Not a mere copy, but an amplified, warped version of every moment of fear, panic, and obsession I had felt since the first shout. It shouted, screamed, pleaded. It mocked me. I could feel it resonating inside my skull, vibrating my bones, twisting my mind into a loop of terror. Cool me. Stay. Join. Don't leave. It was no longer outside of me. It was me. Every scream, every whisper, every dragging sound was drawn from my own essence, now weaponized and returned as the shed's feed. I was both observer and prey, both shouter and listener, trapped in a cycle I couldn't comprehend or escape. The black center of the shed pulsed in front of me. I fell to my knees, staring into it. Shapes swirled within. My own face distorted, screaming. Faces of the lost, the missing, the absorbed. The air seemed to vibrate, pull, stretch around me. The walls of the shed themselves rippled like water. Shadows became tangible, pressing at my limbs, wrapping around me, dragging me forward. I tried to resist. I struggled. But every movement I made, every attempt to retreat, was mirrored and countered by the shed. My own body seemed to betray me, moving toward the pulsing darkness. I realized what the previous victims must have felt. The shed didn't kill. Not directly. It assimilated. It shattered perception and fractured consciousness, drawing fragments of the mind into its own essence. It created echoes, whispers, shadows, reflections, all feeding it, strengthening it, and perpetuating the cycle. And now it had me. I screamed, but the sound that came out was not my own. It was the distorted, warped echo the shed had been shaping all along. I clawed at the walls, at the floor, at the black center itself. The shadows pressed harder, wrapping around my arms, my legs constricting, pulling, folding me inward, and then came the final awareness. The shed wasn't just behind me. It wasn't confined to the field or the structure itself. It existed in me and, through me, in the world around me. Every whisper, every echo, every shadow I'd seen outside, neighbors' trees, mirrors, daylight, was the shed projecting, extending, replicating. I was no longer just a human being in a building. I was a component of a living entity, an intelligence that existed in perception, feeding on the terrified awareness of anyone it could touch. My consciousness was being woven into it, my essence pulled apart, twisted, and integrated into its structure. Time dissolved entirely. I can't tell you how long I struggled, how long I screamed in a voice that was both mine and not mine. The echoes overlapped with themselves, layering in waves of horror. Each iteration pulled me deeper. My sense of self splintered until I was 1,000 versions of me, each one screaming, pleading, resisting, and yet feeding the entity further. I began to see glimpses of what the shed was, a black void pulsing with stolen consciousness. Inside it, fragments of those who had vanished before me, their echoes preserved, twisted, and folded into the structure of the shed. I realized I would join them, not in death, but in eternal reflection, my fear and my mind consumed to perpetuate the next cycle. And then I heard another voice. Not the whisper, not the echo. A voice from outside. A distant human voice, faint, calling a name I did not recognize. For the first time in weeks or months, I registered a sound that was real, not generated by the shed. The echoes shifted, layered over this new sound. The shadows paused, as if considering the intrusion. The dragging noises slowed. For a moment, I had a sense of choice, a fleeting awareness that perhaps I could resist. And then the black center pulsed. It drew me in completely. The shadows, the echoes, the dragging sounds, all merged into a singular sensation of being folded, compressed, and absorbed. My vision tunneled. My consciousness fragmented further. I felt every scream I had ever heard in the shed resonate within me, amplifying, merging, until I could not distinguish my own mind from the entity itself. The last thing I remember is being folded into darkness, a fragment of consciousness suspended in endless echoes. I'm still aware. I still scream. But I am no longer separate. I am part of it. The shed consumes fear, attention, perception, and identity. And in doing so, it ensures the cycle continues. If you hear the shouting echo in the empty shed, know this. It is not someone else. It is the shed speaking through me, through them, through you, and it will never stop. The shed waits. The shadows wait. The echoes wait. And if you approach, it will be your turn to shout, to whisper, to be folded into the darkness, a fragment of the echo that feeds the cycle. There is no escape.